By 1945, the outcome of the Second World War had already been decided. Germany was going to lose. And yet, Hitler believed he could make the Allies bleed long enough and hard enough that their morale would crack. In short, there would be no German surrender. Meanwhile, the Allies were equally determined that there would be no treaty to end this conflict. As a result, the Second World War would end, as Robert Citino put it, not with a whimper, not even with a bang, but with a bloodbath. Pro rata, 1945 was the bloodiest year of the Second World War in terms of military deaths, as the seismic industrial power of the Allies drove against the German people, many of whom were ready to die rather than give in to their hated enemies. In this two-part series, we'll explore how the Second World War in Europe came to an end. In this first episode, we'll use objects, film and photography from the IWM collection to take an in-depth look at the Western Front in 1945. What was the German strategy? How did the Allies pull off a bigger encirclement than at Stalingrad? And why didn't the Western Allies take Berlin? This is the story of Germany's downfall in the West.
The future of Europe was still an open question among the Western Allies. For instance, British Prime Minister Churchill did not trust Stalin, particularly in relation to Poland and the Balkans, and wanted to advance as far east as possible. On the other hand, American President Franklin D. Roosevelt was primarily concerned with the formation of the United Nations after the war and building a lasting peace, which meant treading more carefully with Stalin. However, the man who would really decide this question was Allied Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower. He was a professional military officer to the letter, and his orders were the total destruction of Germany's armed forces.
By the end of January 1945, the Allies had decisively defeated the German winter offensives of 1944. While this had come at a significant cost, the Allies could still replace their losses. The Germans could not. Even better, the Soviets had launched a massive offensive on the Eastern Front, getting within 40 miles of Berlin and pulling German reinforcements away from the west. As a result, the Western Allies had an advantage of 5-2 in men and artillery, more than 3-1 in aircraft, and roughly 10-1 in tanks. Eisenhower planned to focus this mass in the north with Montgomery's 21st Army Group. With Bradley's 12th and Dever's 6th armies operating further south, they would encircle Germany's industrial heartland, the Ruhr, and then break out into the North German plain. However, there was one major obstacle in their way: the River Rhine. Averaging 400 metres wide, the river had served as a vital defensive barrier throughout German history. For the German commander in the west, Gerd von Rundstedt, the river was his last hope.
Though on paper he had 80 divisions at his disposal, they were severely depleted, with some only having a fifth of their full strength. For reserves, Germany had to rely on the Volkssturm, essentially a poorly trained militia made up of young boys, older men, and those generally unfit for military service. And while they did have some tanks and aircraft, there was nowhere near enough fuel to use them effectively. Von Rundstedt believed that the most effective defense of Germany could only be mounted from behind the natural barrier of the Rhine River, but this meant giving up large swathes of German territory west of the river, which Hitler would not agree to. Instead, he ordered von Rundstedt to adopt a stand and fight to the last man strategy, refusing to allow his forces to give up an inch of German territory. This strategy would delay the Allies in the short term, but in the long term, it would only serve to hasten German defeat.
Eisenhower wanted to destroy as many German units as he could before he reached the Rhine to make his crossing as easy as possible. But to do that, he first had to cross the Siegfried Line. This 390-mile-long defensive system stretched from the Dutch to the Swiss borders and featured pillboxes, trenches, mines and dragon's teeth. The Western Allies had already had some success penetrating this in 1944, but they now planned to break the line entirely and clear the heavily urbanised area known as the Rhineland. On the 8th of February 1945, the final Western offensives of the war began. The Allied attack began with a pincer move, Operations Veritable and Grenade. Initially, Veritable made strong progress. However, Grenade had to be delayed when a combination of heavy rains and German sabotage flooded the Ruhr River. This allowed the Germans to move extra forces north and slow the Allied advance in brutal, attritional fighting. At the end of February, water levels on the Ruhr fell enough for Operation Grenade to begin. With the German reserves drawn in further north, the American attack made rapid progress. By the 10th of March, all German units in the sector had withdrawn across the river, blowing the bridges behind them. This success continued further south when Bradley's 12th Army Group launched Operation Lumberjack on the 1st of March. Exploiting bridgeheads over the Earth River, the 1st and 3rd Armies rapidly advanced towards the Rhine.
On the 7th of March, elements of the US 9th Armored Division arrived at the town of Remagen, where they were stunned to see the Ludendorff rail bridge still standing. Wanting to seize this incredible opportunity, A Company of the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion under Lieutenant Karl Timmermann were ordered to cross and capture the bridge. Timmermann was fully aware that the Germans could blow the bridge as they crossed, but pressed on with his men regardless. As they approached the bridge, the Germans detonated one of the charges, creating a 30-foot crater in front of the entrance to the bridge that prevented tanks from assisting with the crossing. A second explosion followed that physically lifted the bridge, but it was still intact when the smoke cleared. Under fire, Timmermann and his men fought their way across the bridge, cutting explosive wires as they went, and secured a ridge on the eastern side. 24 hours later, 8,000 American troops had crossed the river. The Germans, of course, realized the significance of this and spent the next 10 days trying to destroy the bridge using a variety of means, including by artillery fire, air bombardment, and even launching 11 V-2 rockets at the bridge. All attempts failed, but on the 17th of March, the bridge unexpectedly collapsed, killing 28 and injuring 93. However, by that time, American engineers had built both a treadway bridge and a pontoon bridge over the river. The Allies finally had a bridgehead over the Rhine.
Last but not least, on the 13th of March, the 3rd and 7th Armies launched Operation Undertone to exploit these earlier successes. Though the 7th Army moved slowly against the Siegfried Line, the 3rd Army made rapid progress, threatening to trap the German forces on the west bank of the river. Hitler decided to replace von Rundstedt with Albert Kesselring, but the new commander was unable to stem the tide. By the time Kesselring issued a final withdrawal order on the 23rd of March, it was too late. Just as it had been on the Eastern Front, Hitler's order to stand and fight was catastrophic. By the end of the Rhineland offensive, the Germans had lost the equivalent of 20 divisions, which included 250,000 men captured and around 100,000 dead or wounded. This was a significant victory for the Allies, but their commanders were beginning to squabble. Since February, Montgomery had been building up for a typically methodical assault crossing of the Rhine, with a build-up of men and supplies comparable to that of D-Day. His fellow American commanders were unimpressed.
Montgomery was motivated by the desire to conserve men and equipment and keep casualties to a minimum. With the forces that Montgomery had at his disposal, there was no need for risk or even urgency in achieving what many believed could be the final nail in the coffin for Germany. However, several American commanders disagreed with Montgomery's cautious approach. General Courtney Hodges, who commanded the 1st US Army, wanted to launch a breakout from his Remagen bridgehead as soon as possible, but he was stopped by Eisenhower. Meanwhile, General Patton was unwilling to let Montgomery cross the Rhine before him. With little preparation and no preceding air or artillery bombardment, Patton's 3rd Army crossed at Nierstein the day before Montgomery's assault. Patton's riskier approach didn't always pay off, however, as was demonstrated a few days later with a disastrous raid deep into enemy lines to liberate a prisoner of war camp, which resulted in 2 American companies being virtually wiped out. The 12th Army Group now had multiple bridgeheads across the Rhine, yet Eisenhower still made the 21st Army Group his priority.
Montgomery's attack would consist of 2 parts: Operation Plunder, an amphibious assault by 3 Corps, and Operation Varsity, an airborne landing behind enemy lines. He hoped that this would facilitate a quick breakout into the Ruhr, and possibly onwards to Berlin. At his disposal were more than 1.25 million men, while Allied intelligence estimated that the Germans had just 85,000 troops defending the sector. On the night of the 23rd of March, Operation Plunder began.
Following a 3-hour artillery bombardment by thousands of guns, as well as air bombardments from RAF Bomber Command, Allied troops began their attack at 9 p.m. Assault troops were ferried in amphibious vehicles like the tracked LVT Buffalo, as well as simpler assault boats. Supporting them were floating Sherman DD tanks, like those used in the invasion of Normandy. In most places, the crossings were unopposed, but the 1st Commando Brigade at Wesel and the 51st Highland Division at Reis met stiff resistance in their efforts to clear the bombed-out urban centers. In the morning after the assault crossings, engineers started the bridging operations that would ensure the fast flow of men and vehicles across the river in the days and weeks to come. One such vehicle was the Comet cruiser tank, which made its debut on the battlefield in March 1945. The Comet was a development of the Cromwell, featuring a 77mm high-velocity gun and a wider, lower-profile turret, as well as increased armor. The introduction of the Comet, although very late in the war, was intended to counter Germany's late war tanks like the Tiger and Panther. Unlike the Cromwell, the Comet's armament was capable of knocking these tanks out, and a Comet would indeed knock out a Tiger on the 13th of April during the Battle of the Ruhr Pocket.
Operation Varsity began on the morning of the 24th. From around 10 a.m. to 12:30 p.m, nearly 1,700 transport aircraft and more than 1,300 gliders dropped close to 17,000 airborne troops, making Varsity the largest ever airdrop to take place in a single day. Apart from the erroneous dropping of an American parachute battalion in the British drop zone, the drops were relatively accurate. Resistance was encountered, but all objectives were achieved within a few hours, virtually wiping out the German 84th Infantry Division. Link-up with the crossing forces was made by evening.
We've come to one of our conservation spaces here at IWM Duxford to look at some personal items from someone who flew in Operation Varsity, John Cecil Bailey of the RAF. Bailey, who is from County Durham, flew Hanley Page Halifax's with 644 Squadron and had previously been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross during Operation Market Garden. Here we have Bailey's flying logbook, in which he recorded the historic operation simply as Ops as Ordered, Germany. Also on display here is Bailey's sheepskin Irvin flying jacket, his Mark 8 flying goggles, and his 1941 pattern flying gauntlets. During Operation Varsity, Bailey's Halifax towed a Hamilcar glider loaded with a 17-pounder anti-tank gun and a Dodge truck. He successfully released it without encountering any enemy fire. Within 3 days, the Allies had established a firm bridgehead that was 35 miles wide and 20 miles deep. However, the breakout was not immediate. Roads were poor in the American sector, and there was huge congestion in and around Wesel. That, plus the commitment of the German Armored Reserve, slowed the Allied advance.
At the same time, further south, the 12th Army Group launched a breakout from their bridgeheads. Walter Modell's Army Group B was expecting the Allies to push north from Remagen towards the Ruhr. Instead, they went east, outflanking the German defences. The 1st and 3rd Armies drove miles into the German lines, capturing town after town. By the time they turned north towards Paderborn, Montgomery's forces had broken the German line in the north. On the 1st of April, the two pincers met at Lippstadt, sealing well over 300,000 Germans in a giant pocket in the Ruhr, more than at Stalingrad. By now, the German forces were falling apart. The rest of the Allied armies crossed the Rhine, while a newly created 15th Army was brought in to hold the pocket closed. The gains were spectacular, and the capture of Berlin seemed a real possibility. But while Allied commanders were desperate to charge on the German capital, Eisenhower decided against it.
It had already been agreed in 1944 and then reinforced at the Yalta Conference in 1945 that Berlin would be in the Soviet zone of occupation. Thus, Eisenhower believed that there was no military or even symbolic value in capturing Berlin, a virtually destroyed city that would eventually have to be handed over to the Soviets. He had also been told to expect around 100,000 casualties in making a drive for the city, which he was not prepared to accept. Another factor were rumors about Germany's supposed national redoubt in the Alps. This concept, developed by Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler, envisaged a mountainous fortress where the Nazis would make their last stand. Worried that this would inflict unacceptably heavy casualties on the Allies and lengthen the war, Eisenhower ordered his forces to stop their advance at the Elbe River, before shifting his focus further south. Eisenhower was unaware, however, that the Alpine fortress was merely a product of German deception efforts and did not actually exist.
As the Allies continued their advance to the Elbe, the Ruhr pocket was gradually closed. Hitler once again refused any attempts to break out from the pocket, ordering his forces to stand and fight. But rather than surrender, Model chose to disband his Army Group B and take his own life. Resistance eventually collapsed by mid-April, with 317,000 German soldiers becoming prisoners of war. Meanwhile, Allied mobile units charged headlong into central Germany, leaving infantry units to mop up behind them. German resistance varied wildly from token to fanatical. At Leipzig and Nuremberg, for example, German anti-aircraft guns were turned on American infantry, causing heavy casualties, while a holdout force of 70,000 German reinforcements was encircled and destroyed in the Harz Mountains. On the 11th of April, advance units of the 9th Army reached the Elbe River, and on the 25th, American forces had their first official link-up with the Soviets. The Second World War was coming to an end, and humanitarian efforts to rebuild Europe were getting underway.
By early 1945, food shortages in the Netherlands had developed into a full-blown famine. Deaths from starvation and other famine-related causes reached around 22,000 by late April 1945, with nearly 1 million more severely malnourished. On the 30th of April, a ceasefire was agreed with the Nazi Reichskommissar of the Netherlands, meaning Allied aircraft delivering food would not be fired on as long as they stuck to pre-designated air corridors. Both the RAF and United States Army Air Force bombers, typically used to dropping bombs from high altitude, dropped the food supplies at very low levels, due to the fact that there were not enough parachutes available for the operation. Bomber crews often added personal touches, sometimes adding chocolate and sweets from their own rations to the food containers. And for many pilots, these missions were their favorite moments of the Second World War, and their efforts were highly successful and partially relieved the famine.
By now, Allied soldiers were making shocking discoveries all across Germany, including the liberation of the concentration camp at Bergen-Belsen on the 15th of April. With the Soviets engaged in the final battle for Berlin, American forces turned south to link up with Allied armies who had finally broken German lines in Italy. Together with the Soviets, they moved into Austria and Czechoslovakia, ensuring that there would be no national redoubt. By the beginning of May 1945, Hitler was dead, and the Third Reich's new head of state, Karl Dönitz, knew that the end had come. His primary concern now was the surrender of his troops. Fearing brutal reprisals if they were captured by the Soviets, he ordered his formations to turn west and give themselves up to the Western Allies.
On the morning of the 3rd of May, a German delegation headed by Hans-Georg von Friedeberg arrived at Montgomery's headquarters at Lüneburg Heath. They had hoped to be able to surrender the approximately 500,000 troops of Army Group Vistula, now trapped in a desperate battle with the Soviets north of Berlin. But Montgomery refused, stating that anything east of his lines was, quote, Russian business. He would only accept the unconditional surrender of German forces in his area of operations. The Germans returned the following afternoon, and Montgomery took von Friedeberg into his caravan to show him this document and ask if he would agree to the terms. At 6:30 p.m. in a tent set up especially for the ceremony, von Friedeberg and his delegation signed the instrument of surrender, which would come into effect the next morning at 8 a.m. As you can see in the document, the terms applied to all German forces in Holland, Northwest Germany, the Frisian Islands, and Heligoland. And as we can see, there's an addition made to the document saying that the terms also apply to all German naval vessels in these areas. We also see a change in the time to 0800 from when the terms will take effect. And we can also see von Friedeberg's signature, as well as some of the other delegation, and then Montgomery's signature, dated the 4th of May 1945 at 18:30 hours. With this affecting around 500,000 German personnel, this became the largest surrender of German troops during the entire war.
Up and down the Allied lines, smaller scale surrenders took place, along with a preliminary unconditional surrender on the 7th of May at SHAEF headquarters in Ram. However, the Soviets demanded a further signing in Berlin, which took place the next evening and represented the official, unconditional surrender of the Third Reich. The Second World War in Europe, for most, was finally over. While this brought unimaginable joy, it was also tinged with sadness. Fighting continued in some places, while a refugee crisis would grip the continent for years to come. There was also the knowledge that Japan was yet to be defeated. Around 40 million people lost their lives in the European theatre alone during the Second World War, and that number was primarily made up of civilians who continue to bear the brunt of modern warfare to this day. Meanwhile, on the other side of Berlin, the Iron Curtain was beginning to fall. Join us in the next episode as we explore the end of the Second World War on the Eastern Front.